Welcome to the webinar about backwards design and alignment mapping, which is all centered around proper course and/or module design. We're going to look at three major objectives in the recorded portion of this webinar, meaning the fourth objective about providing real-time support really will happen in the live portion. So in the recorded session, I will chunk this into three pieces, one focusing on the differentiation between instructor-centered and student-centered course design, a second video explaining the tenets of the backwards design model, and then finally a third video about developing a fully aligned unit using the backwards design process. So first, let's talk about backwards design in context. When we compare models as far as typical course design versus backwards design, typical course design usually plays out as you see in the infographic here. Typically, we choose our resources, we choose our textbook, then we may prepare our content around that, things like our PowerPoints, our lesson plans, maybe even the selection of readings or videos to watch. Then based on that, we may go and write our assessments. And those assessments in that particular case may or may not be aligned to our course objectives because they're probably aligned to the tools that we selected, the content that we selected. Then we write a course outline, usually thought of as some sort of schedule, looking at module 1, then module 2, etc., and then development of a syllabus, which a lot of times the course objectives either are misaligned compared to everything that we presented, where, for example, requiring students in our course objectives to discuss certain concepts, but yet we wrote assessments that really required them to identify, which is usually a multiple choice type of question. So things don't necessarily get aligned, and everything is very instructor-centered. A lot of it is thought of as, what am I going to do? What am I going to do as the instructor to keep the students in mind? Where backwards design, on the other hand, actually starts with, if you have program outcomes, starts with those, and those really steer the identification and development of the course learning outcomes or the course objectives. And those course objectives are thought of from the higher levels of Bloom's typically. Things like make justifications or create some sort of product to present at the end. We typically think of it as the summative, the sum of all the parts of everything that's going to be learned. So what are the end goals of the course? Then those assessments are designed keeping those end goals, those course learning outcomes in mind. So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between summative assessments and formative assessments. Our summative assessments are usually aligned with those course outcomes. Finally, after we've designed our assessments, now we actually get into the planning of the learning activities, the content, selecting the readings and the resources, and possibly the textbook. This is where sometimes frustration sets in because we may actually end up, instead of going linearly through a textbook, we may end up jumping around through a textbook. Chapter 1, then to chapter 4, back to chapter 2, something like that, because maybe that makes the most sense when we're actually designing the course. But what this all comes down to is this type of course design is actually very student-centered. So when we think about learner-centered or student-centered, what does this mean? As you can see in the triangle here, the pyramid, the student is at the center. And we have our learning objectives, teaching and learning activities, and assessment strategies all working together and in alignment with the student and the student needs. Ultimately, it is their learning that matters and their progress that matters, mastery of content that matters. So all teaching and learning activities are based on those learning objectives. All assessment strategies are based on those learning objectives. All teaching and learning activities are geared toward helping students become successful on those assessments, and so on and so forth, all interconnected pieces. We're teaching for understanding with backwards design. So just to break this down very quickly, first thing we do in step 1 here, determine those learning goals and objectives. We really identify what are those course level objectives, those higher level Bloom's objectives. Then we break it down into the module level objectives. So if you have 8 modules planned, each of those 8 modules will have its own very specific module objectives that also correlate with the course objectives. We'll plan the assessments. Summative assessments would be planned first. In a typical course, this may mean a midterm exam and a final exam, and those may be the only two summative assessments. But I would take this a step further and recommend that at the end of each module or chapter, we can have sort of a smaller summative assessment, a chapter test or module test, or chapter quiz, module quiz. Those sum up those chunked pieces of information that we consider to be the modules. Formative assessments are the practice along the way. What will students do and get feedback on that will help them perform very well on those summative assessments. And therefore we can really measure and observe their success toward both the module and course objectives as the course progresses. And then finally, planning those learning activities. This means activities, things like watching a lecture, engaging in a discussion, reading a PDF or reading through a chapter or a PowerPoint, or working through certain activities like a role play. The interactions would be outlined with things like student interactions with each other, student interactions with faculty members, and then student interactions with the content. So a lot of times hopefully you're seeing the crossover between activities and interactions are kind of one and the same, but making sure there's attention paid to each kind of interaction, student to student, student to learn, to instructor, and student to content. The tools that are used are very targeted. They're tools that should support the learning objectives, both the module and course level, and support the activities that students will engage in. They're not selection of digital tools, for example, just for the sake of it. But if students are asked to discuss certain concepts, then discussion posts should be used. If they're asked to explain things, either a discussion post or a third-party tool, something like Padlet might be leveraged, or simply a live Zoom meeting in breakout rooms. So the tools are also aligned with this, and it's very targeted in why they're selected. So to recap real quick, what is backwards design? Putting it in context, we build with the end in mind and from the learner-centered perspective. Course objectives and module objectives are clear, they're measurable, and they are scaffolded. We plan for both formative and summative assessments along the way. Those formatives allow the students to practice and receive meaningful feedback so they can make their adjustments as the module progresses. They're getting the feedback on the discussions. They're getting feedback on quick little homework assignments or tickets out the door or in those breakout rooms in Zoom. So clarification is made before they take that summative, right? So they can fix their mistakes. Summatives provide the key diagnostic data for instructors. We can identify the gaps between student knowledge and learning targets, and then we can improve the curriculum. So for example, on that midterm exam, when we identify that 90% of students missed a particular question, we can now really inspect that question. Was it a poorly written question? Was it something that maybe was not paid enough attention to in the content of the course? Do we need to bring that into the PowerPoints and the lectures and the readings? You can really identify where the gaps are and how to rectify them. Refining that assessment criteria also helps us really make sure that our learning objectives are appropriate for the course. We can design authentic and engaging learning activities and interactions. Again, when we think about discussion or creation is even a better one, right? Leveraging the world to design activities and interactions that really are something that the students would eventually have to do in the workplace or in the real world anyways. So the activities, especially when we think about justifications and creation, how often on the job do we actually need to problem solve? We're putting students in positions to problem solve, and it's geared back toward those course and module level objectives. Feedback should be frequent and timely, okay, detailed and meaningful. So timely meaning when a student submits a discussion, we're not providing that feedback 3 weeks later, that they're getting that feedback in a quick time frame so they can actually use that feedback to make real-time adjustments prior to the next formative or the next summative assessment. So that way they can learn from their mistakes and have the proper coaching along the way. And as I mentioned also with technology, consider the role of technology and how it's going to be supported. While students typically are thought of as working great with technology, the reality is They are not digital natives. That's, in my opinion, a misnomer for sure. The students know how to manipulate the tools that they're interested in, things like TikTok or Instagram. They are not necessarily experts with PowerPoint or experts with creating videos that they would submit for courses, or even experts with something like Google Docs when submitting first drafts. They can probably do many of the basics, but consider what the tools are and what extra support students are going to need, and then does the usage of those tools actually support the module and/or course objectives? And ultimately, everything in the course is interconnected, as we saw in the pyramid with the student at the center, as we will definitely see in other diagrams throughout this series. Every aspect of a module serves a purpose that is directly related to both the course objectives and the module objectives. In the second part of this, we'll take a look at the tenets of the backwards design model.